When it comes to criminal justice, we see that God's point of view is on the side of the victims, and its thrust is to vindicate victims.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. It's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to ask you for a 90-second favor. Please go to the favorite platform and review the show. More people will see it. More people will know about these interviews with these guests who are major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. My guest today is an ethicist and a speaker who specializes in connecting morality with human flourishing. He obtained his master's degree in Christian ethics from the University of Oxford and is going to share on a very difficult topic. I'm just going to warn you in advance. We will cover some mature content today because we'll be talking about what healing from sexual abuse looks like from a biblical worldview. Please welcome Will Tant to the show. Will Tant, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thank you.
We recently met in person, but I had heard your story for some time. A professional surfer, and you had a life-threatening illness that forced you to really choose between the thing that you loved and had done your whole life and living, basically continuing to live. And I know in our conversation, and you and Trip Allman from our staff and I were in this conversation, we very quickly went toward the nature of suffering. And what do you do in those times when it seems that you're all alone and you can't find relief? So I'm really grateful for your coming on the show because I wanted to go there. You know, on this show, we go there. We don't want to just ignore difficult issues or put a happy face on it. We want to talk about tough things. So thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I agree. I think we have to go there because people are really suffering. And this is a lived reality for so many people, you know, whether it's a health condition or just life in general, it's difficult. And I think that, from what I found so far, the Christian worldview gives you a tremendous amount of resources to deal with that.
It absolutely does. And we want to get into that. I do want to let people know, if you're watching or listening and you got the kids in the car, this is going to be a tougher one. Okay. It's going to be tougher. You might want to be discerning about whether you want to continue, because we're going to talk about some really tough things. So just make that little disclaimer right up front.
Yeah, it's important.
So Will, one of the topics that we talked about when we connected here in Manitou Springs recently was the topic of sexual abuse. And your career path is fascinating to me, and from professional surfer to professional fashion model to Christian apologist, and which is not a normal career path. I just want you to know that.
Yeah, it's definitely unexpected, but yeah, it's one that does make sense if I can tell my whole story at some point.
Yeah. Well, you studied at Columbia University, studied religious studies. Then you went to Oxford University, studied under the Christian ethics program there, especially under Nigel Becker, who is, a legendary figure in Christian ethics. And I'm reading his most recent book right now on colonialism.
Yeah.
So it's a whole lot there to talk about. But I'd like to really focus in, as much as we're able to, and the Lord provides during this conversation, on this question of sexual abuse. I would like to really talk about a biblical worldview of healing from sexual abuse. And I don't know the best way to enter into that conversation with you. Would you like to share some of your experiences or how you came to think or talk about this?
Sure. Yeah. It's the topic of sexual abuse. It's one, unfortunately, that I've experienced in my life, being sexually abused. I was sexually abused at a young age, from the age of 14, 15 to 16. It was a coach and his wife. And it wasn't just me, it was a lot of other team members as well. And then I experienced sexual abuse later in life too. in the fashion industry a few times. So I've experienced it as a child and as an adult. And it's not something I couldn't talk about this topic for, for a very long time in my life. In fact, I didn't really I didn't admit it that it happened until 15 years after it happened.
Mm.
So it wasn't until my 30s. But I do think that when we look at the biblical tradition, we do see a God who cares about these situations deeply. And he is a God of healing and restoration. And we see that sort of within the mandate for justice and pursuing justice. And so part of the reason why I went and studied Christian ethics is because I could see that in scripture. And when I began to look around the world around me, I care very deeply about issues of justice. And I see that God does much more so than I do. And
Yeah.
he gives us a really unique framework to be able to accomplish a tremendous amount of healing um, through the mechanism of justice. People often don't realize that.
Well, I appreciate the way you're framing it. We're not talking today as therapists. We're not trying to help uh, counsel people. That's not the purpose of our conversation. The purpose of our conversation is to try to understand how God sees the issues of justice and
Mm,
injustice that we see in our world, specifically related to something that a lot of people who are watching or listening have personally experienced.
mm.
So thank you for that. Help us frame out the conversation by we use this term human flourishing a lot. In other words, we're not just saying, okay, we know justice because we can identify injustice, and justice is whatever that is not.
Mhm.
But but when you think about this as a Christian ethicist, you're thinking about this larger idea. Can you talk about it a little bit? How we should be thinking about human flourishing.
Yeah, I think it's people often don't realize this, and I didn't realize it to be honest until I really sat down within and studied Christian ethics. And it's that we do often talk about the term of human flourishing, and we often talk about it in the sense of how do I live a life that allows me to flourish as an individual.
Hmm.
And so there can be talks about what kind of career to pursue, to find your passion. That kind of frames a lot of the conversations when it comes to human flourishing. But what people don't often realize is that justice is a mechanism for human flourishing,
Hmm.
and that when we talk about justice from a Christian worldview, the question is, what is the point of justice? What is the aim of justice? Is justice simply just to hold someone accountable for what they've done? So in this case, is it to hold someone accountable for abusing you? Or does justice point beyond that to restoration, to healing individuals, relationships, communities, to restoring those? And that is where human flourishing really begins to take place. So justice isn't an end in itself. It's not just simply about holding someone accountable. It's about achieving flourishing in a community, in a relationship, and in an individual's life. And so they're very connected.
Yeah. Well, this I really appreciate that distinction. We've talked about justice from a theoretical perspective on this
Mm.
show. You
Mm.
know, biblical justice versus social justice,
Yeah.
things like that. But what what would you say? Because you see justice all throughout Scripture. What is God heading toward? If we're to ask God, what do you see? Help us from Scripture what God sees, what a
Yeah.
just society would be like.
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to, if we look at sexual abuse, to keep it specific on that, or any sort of criminal justice, um, and this is, Professor Nigel Bigger, his framework that I'm using mainly is that when it comes to criminal justice, we see that God's point of view is on the side of the victims, and its thrust is to vindicate victims, those who have been, abused, those who have been oppressed or marginalized. We see that cry throughout the Old Testament, the prophetic tradition, and then we see it the way Jesus interacts with people as well. And so the primary thrust of criminal justice in a biblical perspective is to vindicate victims. And so, when it comes to the issue of sexual abuse, it allows us to restore their dignity in the community, to acknowledge that it happened, to try to establish the truth, to find out what happened, how it happened, who was responsible. And you can take those steps to to achieve justice apart from actually punishing the perpetrator. And that doesn't mean that punishing the perpetrator is not down the road and it's not involved. It absolutely is. But as far as the real focus here in criminal justice from the biblical perspective is to vindicate victims.
Yeah, I appreciate your point about restoring the dignity of people who've been hurt. Uh, I don't often hear that as a point of emphasis.
Oh yeah, you can imagine the last time that something happened to you and that no one did anything. What does that convey to someone? It says that what happened to you doesn't matter because your life doesn't matter.
Mm.
And so by acknowledging that the sexual abuse happened, it begins to restore that person as an equal member of the community, as someone who has equal status among everyone else. And so just by acknowledging that the abuse happened, that's a step that you can take even apart from pursuing, punishment, retributive punishment. And then figuring out the nuances. Imagine, if you have a kid or a young person and they gets abused and no one does any research to figure out how this happened, why it happened, who was responsible. And if no one does that, it takes the time to really think through it or to put new measures in place to prevent it from happening. What does that convey to someone?
Mm.
And so it really is about restoring the dignity of someone who has been abused, and it allows the community a real opportunity to speak out, to say that that kind of behavior isn't appropriate here. And it says that we're going to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen on our watch again. And for a victim, to have people come alongside you in that is incredibly healing, and it's hopeful.
Well, it, I want you don't have to answer this question, but I'm just I wanted to press on it a little bit because it seems so important. You mentioned that it took 15 years
Mm.
for you to admit that the abuse took place.
Yeah.
Um, Help me understand what was going on during those 15 years or what happened at the end of that and what the breakthrough was.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's one I welcome because I really hope that, uh, if someone's listening to this, that they've been abused, or if they know someone, that they would send this podcast along because, to your point, Jeff, uh, I was silenced for 15 years. And as far as I can tell, the reason why is because I felt so much shame and guilt around what happened to me. And I think within the moral culture that I think I operated in, to admit that I was abused was to admit that I was weak, and that somehow I had been weaker than others. And so for me to admit that raised a lot of questions about myself. It raised a lot of questions about, my public reputation, that no one knew about this. And for the most part, I had done a pretty good job of hiding it apart from my personal life. But I think it was just a tremendous amount of shame and guilt. And you can imagine, like, for a 14, 15, and 16-year-old to go through something like this, it's very confusing. It's a very confusing experience to have. And then you don't know who you can tell. And, I've had the conversation with my parents, and I eventually told them, and they asked the same question. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to read into the situation from a 30-year-old mind what was happening in a 14-year-old mind.
Right.
That's what you want to avoid. You want to listen, you're 14, 15, or 16 years old. You're very young. And so it's a very confusing world when that happens. And I would just say that I wish I would have been able to tell someone earlier.
Mm.
I really do, because to wait 15 years to be able to even say these words to someone out loud, the amount of damage, the amount of confusion that happens in that amount of time, the coping mechanisms, all of that, it does a tremendous amount of damage to the human soul. And I just encourage, if anyone's out there listening now, that you can take the step. It feels like It's almost like one of those things you feel like there's no way I could do this. But the moment that you do it, I literally thought to myself, why did I wait 15 years to do
Right.
this?
Yeah. I think abuse is especially difficult, thinking of the work that we do here at Summit Ministries with young adults.
Hmm.
Abuse is especially difficult because very often the abuse takes place at the hands of the kind of person you should be able to trust.
Yeah.
It's that violation of trust.
Hmm.
If the very people who should be helping you are the ones who are hurting you,
Yeah.
you end up in this kind of a double bind.
Yeah.
You're like those puppies in the experiments where they're shocked if they do this, or shocked if they do this, they just give up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true, and I really appreciate you raising that point because I have a number of people that I'm in conversations with that I talk to and that have come forward to me through circumstance to to recognize and voice to me that hey, this has happened in my life, and one of the very common situations is that this has happened within the family. So you can have someone, a brother or sister, that has done this to another brother or sister, a father or mother who has done this to a son or a daughter, or even in cousins, and so it's very complex to be able to raise and to be able to go to someone and say, "Hey, this person sexually abused me," is to tear apart the family, and so it presents a conundrum. What do I do here? Do I just pretend that this didn't happen and remain silent, or do I move forward and disrupt the peace and pursue justice?
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, again, it is very complex, but you have to understand, and this is where the biblical view is very helpful, that your flourishing is tied to this step.
Mhm.
There is freedom on the other side of this, and you begin to heal in a way that you need to heal. And that's not only true for the victim, it's also true for the perpetrator,
Mhm.
that there is a weight on their side too.
Yeah.
And so when it comes back to human flourishing and justice, and what do you do if this is your situation, you have to understand that A, you're not alone. You will be able to work through this, and you flourishing as an individual is really tied to taking this step.
Mm. Will, what kind of person should somebody be looking for if they've got to share? And again, it could be somebody who's a victim or somebody who's a perpetrator who feels this weight of guilt that is
Mhm.
preventing them from flourishing. What kind of person would you be looking for to help you?
Yeah. Um, I think if it it's difficult because I know experiences where a child has gone to the parent and the parent has tried to figure out a way to resolve this, and it doesn't get resolved, and it causes a lot of damage to the child and to their relationship. And there's also cases where people have gone to a pastor or something, and that hasn't been resolved, and so I think that I would say for me, I did it in my 30s, and I brought 5 or 6 really close friends around me. That was my first step,
Mhm.
is acknowledging that it happened to 5 or 6 really close friends, and then from there, uh, I I knew someone who was a former public attorney for the state of Florida, and I went to him, and he began to help me and he actually helped me talk to my parents about it.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so that,
How did he help in that way?
yeah, uh, I had a friendship with this man, and so I really trusted him and his family, and I knew that he had dealt with these kind of conversations before as a a public attorney, and so he just really helped frame the whole situation with my parents and being able to sit down with them and talk to them and say, hey, Will's here, and this is at the age of 30, Jeff.
Mm. Mm.
So you got to understand, like, the weight and the way that this can control someone who's been abused.
Yeah.
But he was able to kind of frame it in the sense of, hey, we're here today. The first question of my parents is, what has Will done? Because they know that he's a public attorney. And so they're like, oh no, like, what happened? What have you done? But he was like, first thing out of his mouth was that, hey, he hasn't done anything wrong. He just has some things that he wants to get off his chest and tell you. And that helped me because it it forced the issue out in the open.
Mm.
There was no going back at that point. I couldn't, turn away from the situation. And the thing, Jeff, was that the moment I told my parents, I began to receive the care and the acknowledgement that I longed to hear when I was younger.
Mm.
And the fear that I had that they would um, be upset with me that this happened. Ask why didn't I tell you? Those were not those questions came much later down the road.
Yeah.
But initially, it was just, I'm so sorry that this has happened to you. There was a hug and embrace and tears, and that was the beginning of a conversation. I think what's really important for people to know is even once they tell, this is a process. It took me a year and a half to work through everything on my side, and that's with meeting with a counselor once a week. And so, but the first step is the biggest step. It really is the biggest step. But there's a reason why Scripture says the truth will set you free. And it's the moment you begin to actually say, "Hey, this happened to me," um, and you begin to explain the situation. You do experience a freedom in a way that a weight has been lifted off of you. And so, and just to say lastly, that if you know someone who's been abused, it's often really helpful to reach out to someone who has it. If you know they've experienced it in their lives, that might be a good first person too. Particularly if that person, if it is within the family and that person's outside the family, it might be really helpful to bring someone in who has been abused and has walked in the healing process.
Talk to us a little bit, Will, about what you would say to someone who says, where is God in the midst of this?
Mm,
I I was abused by somebody I should have been able to trust. I
mhm.
know it was wrong, but where's God? It's the number one question that our students ask, whether they've been abused or not.
Yeah,
Where is
yeah,
God in this? But if you're having a conversation with someone, help us understand how you process that.
yeah. I think there's the rational response of it, and then there's the lived response of it. I think the rational response is that um, God has given us free will. And with that freedom comes tremendous responsibility on our actions. And I wouldn't say that God wills abuse to happen, but he does allow it, and allowing it in the sense of we're able to use our agency for better, for worse. We see that not just in sexual abuse, we see that in all different cases. And so it really puts the emphasis on us and how we behave in our actions and realize the impact of our actions and the consequences they have in other people around us. That's the realm in which that God allows for that space. And within that space, people abuse. People abuse their power.
Mm.
People, commit sexual abuse. People kill people. And that is the other side of allowing humans to have free will. Um, and so there's a difference though between willing and allowing. And the difference between those is morally significant. And so that's the rational response. I think personally, I found God to be tremendously present in my suffering. Um, Particularly, for me, I was becoming a Christian, and then about 2 years after becoming a Christian, I is when I really kind of began to have conversations about this. And the reason why is because um, my security and my identity was secure. My identity was secure in God, and it allowed me to have conversations about my past in a way that I never had the courage before. And so it was actually because I was a Christian and because I believed that God um, loved me tremendously, more than I could ever acknowledge, that it gave me the security to be in that. And I know that relationship is secure. Then I could have the conversations about, hey, this happened to me. And I say that because it's almost like, don't be surprised if you become a Christian and the Holy Spirit is going to start moving in your life to bring healing in these areas, because he wants to heal these areas. And when it comes to, particularly suffering in this case, he gives us this tremendous resource to be able to pursue healing. And that's justice, but also the forgiveness piece. Forgiveness is a part of justice. it fits within the range. And there's probably no other worldview that's spoken into the importance of forgiveness in regards to flourishing um, and healing than Christianity has.
Uh, you're bringing up that point about forgiveness. Kind of makes me want to go a different direction than what I had thought.
Yeah.
But the what does forgiveness look like? What did it look like for you? Because
Mm.
I'm assuming this wasn't just in my mind. I forgive this person. Now it's all done. But
Yeah.
there's actually this ongoing. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And just to say, like, forgiveness is a very loaded term. There's a lot of misconception around forgiveness. And so I think it is a really, and we could probably do an entire podcast on the concept of forgiveness and the nuances of it. But I'll just say that for me, the process of forgiveness, it included justice. So it included holding the person accountable for what they did. I felt like I had a moral responsibility to do that. And like I mentioned before, I don't think I mentioned this before actually, but I did pursue um, holding them legally accountable
Mhm.
for their actions. And that was a step within the framework of biblical justice that you pursue. And unfortunately, um, because the sexual abuse began to occur when I was 14 and not 13, the statute of limitations had expired.
Oh,
And so
ugh.
there was no secular justice to be had in my case. And that is probably the majority of the outcome for situations like this.
Yeah.
And how this ties into forgiveness, Jeff, is because my motivation, as I pursued secular justice, I realized I was pursuing justice out of the motivation for punishment, but I was also pursuing it out of the motivation for revenge and
Mm.
vengeance. I
Yeah.
was incredibly angry and bitter at this person, and I wanted to hold them accountable and really just retributive punishment. But when there was no secular justice to be had, I began to have this recurring dream where I was actually tasked to hold the person accountable and punish
Mm.
them.
Mm.
And I would punish them all the way up to the point that I knew that if I punished them any longer, they would die, and I would
Mm.
always stop.
Mm.
And so I had this recurring dream, and what I began to realize with the help of my counselor was that there was no amount of justice that could take away the pain and the anger and the damage that this caused in my life. No amount of justice can do that. And so when it came to pursuing justice, it made me realize that um, I could pursue justice out of a place of compassion and concern
Mm.
rather than vengeance. See, before I realized this, and I was pursuing justice, um, essentially to hold the person accountable and destroy them, but I wasn't pursuing it out of a place to restore them.
Mm.
And that's a completely different motivation when it comes to justice. And so when it comes to the forgiveness piece and pursuing forgiveness, the motivation there is restoration.
Yeah.
And so, generally speaking, forgiveness, according to the framework that I've used, it has two steps. And the first step falls on the side of the victim to carry out, and it's the hard, long, tiresome work of healing.
Mm.
And it takes a really long time. And you do that basically out of a position of self care, that you have a responsibility to yourself to heal from this. And it doesn't involve the perpetrator at all. Um, but the second step does involve the perpetrator, the second step of forgiveness. And that's where you would offer forgiveness. But you do so just the same motivation as justice. You do so out of a place of compassion and concern for that person, not out of vengeance, not out to punish them, but that it's a loving thing to hold them accountable, and in holding them accountable and raising the situation and saying, what you did to me caused real harm. Those are steps to restoration, and they can be driven by compassion. And we know that when biblical justice is pursued, it looks very different than secular justice, in that when biblical justice is pursued and it achieves reconciliation, it leaves in its wake peace and
Yeah.
healing rather than bitterness and anger. And those are two different outcomes.
Wow. That's an incredible distinction. And I guess it's probably, we should be clear when you're talking about restoration, you're not talking about restoration between you and the other person as much as you're talking about them being restored to right functioning in with in a way that's just with
Yeah.
God and with the world around them.
Yeah. So it brings in that component, the flourishing, right? So, the philosopher Richard Swinburne in Oxford talks about holding someone accountable is a loving thing to do. So, because it says that your actions have consequences. And that's the very definition of having human agency. And it's a good thing to have human agency. It's a good thing to show that your actions have consequences, because if they don't, the very definition of being helpless. And so it's a loving thing to hold someone accountable. So you can pursue punishment with the aim of restoration. Because let's say, for example, if the person was able to be to put into under a sentence in jail for a certain amount of time, it protects the community.
Mhm.
And that's a sense of a step towards human flourishing for the community. And it protects victims, right?
Yeah.
And indirect victims, those people who identify as someone who feels like they're at risk of being abused. But here's the part that people don't often realize: it also affords the perpetrator the time to reflect upon their actions.
Mm.
And so by giving them that space, that time to reflect on what they've done, that's a loving thing to do. And hopefully the drive in all of this is that they will repent, that they will actually come to terms and realize that what they've done is wrong. Because a big part of the Christian formation part is that we form ourselves through our actions. And so when it comes to someone who commits sexual abuse against someone else, they are committing actions against the design of who God meant them to be. And so by stopping them and not allowing them to have that opportunity, you're actually preventing them from harming themselves.
Mm. Wow. Wow.
And so the moral formation part of the Christian worldview of us as humans is tremendous here when it comes to how we view forgiveness and pursue our own flourishing, but also the flourishing of the perpetrator too. Because initially, like I said, when I was pursuing justice, I was coming from the motivation of anger and bitterness. But as I began to God began to step into my pain and suffering in a real way over the course of counseling, I began to pursue forgiveness and justice out of a place of compassion and restoration. I began to hope that that person would begin to change into the person that God had always meant them to be. I was no longer motivated to destroy them, but to see God restore them.
Mm. Yeah.
And so, and And I know that there's not a lot of situations where a relationship between the victim and the perpetrator could be restored, um, but there are cases where that does happen.
Mhm.
Remember, the point of justice, the point of justice in relation to human flourishing is the restoration of relationship and the restoration of community, the restoration of the victim, and the restoration of the perpetrator. And so the hope there is that everyone will flourish in the way they were meant to be. And if there is an opportunity to have a relationship with someone, like for me, it was my coach, I did welcome that. I did welcome that. And unfortunately, the person didn't accept it.
Mhm.
But I felt like I had, and this isn't true for everyone, but for me, I felt like I did want to confront the person. I did want to talk to them. I did want to say, listen, I offer you forgiveness, and hoping that they would repent and acknowledge that what they did was wrong and take those steps to reconcile the relationship. Um, but they didn't.
Mm. But the process that you went through, you knew was right, and God sounds like God is refining you and your
Mm.
spirit to move toward compassion and a desire for healing,
Mm.
replacing the anger and the desire for vengeance.
Oh yeah, tremendously. Yeah, and it took a long time, Jeff. And I think
Yeah.
for someone who has this has happened to them, they haven't began the journey. when we're talking about forgiveness, we're talking about the later stages of that journey.
Mhm.
Initially, be focused on healing, restoring, helping, helping yourself to heal, bringing in counseling, allowing God to meet you in that. Forgiveness comes much further down the road. And through that time, as you begin to realize that, yes, God was present with me in the healing process and that He has brought a tremendous amount of healing in my life, um, it allows you to change your motivation for what drives you, to hold that person accountable.
Yeah.
It does come a place of from vengeance to restoration, and that's a miracle. Like we talk about, these miracles all the time that Jesus did when He was alive and all that. It's a miracle, Jeff. It is a miracle and I'm not saying that that everything is healed and there's no wounds. There's still scars in my heart. There's still scars in my life. There's still scars in the way I relate to people. Absolutely. And those will probably be there until the other side of heaven. But the amount of healing that I've experienced through this process is night and day.
Yeah. Wow. Uh, as we draw our conversation to a close, I'd love to just get your thoughts on if if the people who are watching or listening, if someone feels safe to confide in you
Mhm.
that abuse has taken place
Mhm.
in their life, what help guide us through what that conversation should look like.
Yeah. Um, I think it goes back to the very beginning of of someone I've had just in the last probably 6 months of my life. I've had five people come to me
Wow.
and have these conversations. When you look at the statistics, Jeff, it is off the chart when you're talking to any amount of people in a room. A lot more people have experienced this than you realize.
Mm.
And so I think the first steps when you're having that kind of conversation and someone comes to you is to if you know them in this way, to hug them and say, I am so sorry you have experienced this. Acknowledge that it happened, and from there, it's a matter of saying, okay, who can I tell? Who can I, some sort of authority figure to get them involved. And so you sort of identify that person. And like you said before, like I'm not a trained counselor. So you have to be careful not to get into that role of being a counselor, but you definitely want to say, listen, I heard you. I see you. I hear you. There is hope in this situation. I'm so proud of you for taking this step.
Yeah.
Now let's see who we can come alongside you in this to be able to get you on the path of healing. And then when it comes to the other steps of whether it's okay, who is the perpetrator? Do you know them? What's your relationship with them? All of that, you get someone else involved with that step, but you really want to champion that person and bring people around them because we can't heal alone.
Right.
We can't heal alone. We need people. And the problem is when someone who's been sexually abused, the wound has happened in a relationship. And what it does, it tends to make people who've been sexually abused very self reliant
Mm.
and very isolated people. And so, them taking that step is tremendous. Affirm it, and then bring three or four people alongside you, alongside that person to walk in the journey. And it's going to take a while. Um, yeah.
Mm. Mm. And I'm super grateful for this conversation.
Mm,
Um, I know it's a tough one. We warned people up front. This is treading into territory that's very difficult.
mm,
But with the level of sexual abuse, living in culture that's governed as much by the sexual revolution as anything else,
mm,
a pornified culture, the chances that any person watching or listening has experienced sexual abuse would be very high,
mm,
and the chances that they would actually know people who may or
mhm.
may not have shared is almost certain,
Yeah.
almost 100%. Um, so thank you for guiding us through this, and I appreciate the way you've helped guide it. in terms of understanding it for, for human flourishing and
Hmm.
justice and forgiveness and healing. And I especially will appreciate your emphasis on how this takes time. Um, there may be some immediate relief that you experience just saying it aloud,
Hmm.
but then recognizing that it's not just like a pressure valve. It's not just like taking a pain pill where okay, that it's all done. I've had this initial conversation, it's done. But that there's work in the
Hmm.
healing, and that God works through the work
Hmm.
to bring about His will.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for your time today, Will. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Jeff.
Thank you to my guest today, Will Tant, for coming on the show. It was a tough topic, but one that really is important for us to address. And I pray that you feel equipped, that you are prepared to help people who've experienced sexual abuse, that if you've experienced sexual abuse, that you have a little better sense maybe of the path to healing, to forgiveness, and to justice. Thanks for joining on the show today. We'll see you next week. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it, and leave a review if you would on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.